Summer Research Institute 2021 Fellows. Welcome. My presentation will focus on Indigenous research. Specifically, I'll be presenting three aspects of Indigenous research. The first part, I'll be presenting who are Indigenous people. In the second part, I'll be presenting what are different theories we utilize or researchers utilize in order to understand or engage in or know about Indigenous people, community, and science education. And then in the third part is what are different aspects of Indigenous research that we should be careful about and also know about before we do any Indigenous research. So one of the things I want to stress right away is that we'll cover different aspects, different theories, different assumptions about Indigenous research, as well as at the end of each of the sections, you'll see a couple of readings or links where you can look at, explore different ways or different kinds of research people have done, or just the information about who are Indigenous people, what's research about, and what should we think about or consider as we engage in Indigenous research. The other thing I want to tell you is that I'm going to shut off my video because it basically obstructs some sections of my presentation. So the very first thing that I want to ask you is that in the map of Indigenous people, where do we see most of the Indigenous people that's been designated or shown? So here we go. If you look at the map of the world, so it's a flat map, Earth is not flat, that we know. So if you look at it, what you see is most of the Indigenous groups or tribes have been located, studied, designated mostly in North America, South America, Australia, and some parts of Europe. If you look at Africa, very few tribes have been located or put on the map, and then the whole of Asia is almost completely blank. So the question always comes up is that what is it about other parts of the world that we haven't explored, or aren't there any Indigenous people there? Obviously, that is not true. So if we look more closely, this is what you see on the map of North America. There are a lot of different tribes. Similarly, if we look at the Australia and New Zealand, you see another big, very colorful map, different Indigenous groups, tribes, and so on. And then if you look at South America, you see the same way, right? You see lots of different colors of different tribes represented. Obviously, I will not go back again, is that in Asia and in Africa, most of the Indigenous groups are not yet designated. And so the question becomes, how do we, or in what ways do these Indigenous communities get not represented, but at the same time, maybe there is something about science in which doesn't allow or maybe didn't represent Indigenous communities. It's not that nobody looked for them, but it just doesn't exist. So before we go into who are Indigenous communities or how do we designate them, I just want to ask you one very quick question. Is that what do we see when we represent science and knowledge? And most of the time, this is what we see. So if you look at this slide, what you see is a lot of science, but the science that you see is very different from the science that this particular slide represents. In the previous slides, you see that the science that's represented had no human beings. There was nobody in there. But if you look at this picture in this science, you see human beings. So one of the big differences that you see in the Western science and indigenous science is that in indigenous science, people are part of it, whereas in Western science, people are always absent. So going into, how do we represent indigenous science and Western science? So if you look at it on four aspects of it, the organizing principle, the habits of mind, skills and processes, and knowledge. So if you look at it, what you see is that in indigenous science or in indigenous knowledge, they are always holistic. They are all about physical and metaphysical aspect of it. But when you look at Western science, what you see is that it's always limited by evidence. It's always pieces are seen. We never see a holistic aspects of it. Similarly, if you look at habits of mind in indigenous science, we always know that the science is connected to human beings, right? And therefore, it trusted over time. It's inherited. Knowledge is inherited. It's not somebody gives you. Whereas in Western science, everything is skepticism. So whatever in indigenous science, when in indigenous communities, whenever they pass knowledge to their youngs, is that that knowledge is accepted as valid. And then if you look at skills and procedures, indigenous science relies on its importance on practical value, right? And the other part of it is that it's always locally situated. Whereas if you look at Western science, it always wants knowledge to be universal, which we know is not possible. Why? Because even in Western science, knowledge is always contextualized in a given space. And so, but in indigenous science, knowledge is always situated in the local community where it's valid, where it's valuable. And then the last part is knowledge. How does knowledge exist? Or what's the value of that knowledge? The value of that knowledge in indigenous communities is that it is always connected to everyday life of people. That knowledge that has been passed through generations always makes lives of people really, really better. It's for well-being of the community. And you'll hear this word well-being from me quite often. Whereas in Western science, it's all discipline. It's always siloed. Its relationship to human beings or the community is afterwards. It never thinks about the community first. Whereas in indigenous knowledge, knowledge is always tied to the community and its well-being. In Western science, the well-being of the community comes afterwards. So the question becomes, who are indigenous people then, right? So we know that the knowledge are different between Western science and indigenous science. We also know that how knowledge gets depicted. We also know that many tribes or indigenous communities around the world are still not being recognized, or they are not being put on the map yet. So the question becomes, who are indigenous people? So one of the definitions that I want you to engage with is the United Nations. United Nations actually does not define who are indigenous people. What it says is that indigenous people and who is indigenous is a self-identification process because it's a human rights issue. And therefore, what we see is we find different names or different words in different languages in order to represent indigenous people or community within their own geographical regions. So let's look at some of them. So the terms for indigenous. So we have a lot of choices now. So let's see the choices. First is, which very likely many of you have seen this, if you have read any work on indigenous science or indigenous people, is tribes, natives, First People, which is mostly used in Canada, Aboriginals, They are generally used in Australia, New Zealand, that part of the world. So right over here, you have 4 different names for indigenous. Let's look at some more. So if you look at another is that sometimes in some places people call it ethnic groups. They are also indigenous. And the last two, which are Adivasi and Janjati, they are in South Asia. Especially you will find them, these words used in South Asia, India, Nepal, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, Bhutan. So Adivasi, the first word in blue in the middle, Adivasi basically means people who were from the beginning in that place. So basically it's temporal. It's based on time. Adi means beginning of time. Basi means people who live there. So Adivasi means people who live there from beginning of time, meaning before them, there were no human beings. Therefore, they are called Adivasi. And the last one is Janjati. Janjati is basically groups of people or members of communities who do not belong to any caste or they do not have any membership in the caste. So they are outside the caste system. Therefore, they are called Janjati. And so both of these groups, Adivasi and Janjati, are indigenous communities or indigenous people in mostly South Asia. These are the 2 words we use. So for us, let's look at some of the characteristics of indigenous people as defined by United Nations. So all the pictures that you see across each of these characteristics are pictures that I have taken from Nepal, right? These are my pictures. So the very first one is self-identification. So if groups of people or individuals, they are accepted in an indigenous community, then they will be called indigenous people. The next one is what we have is historical or pre-colonial or pre-settler society. So that's the continuation of it, right? So if any group of people historically have been designated as indigenous, means they were there before the colonial or the settler time. The other part of it is that what you see is indigenous people have very strong relationship or its connection to the territory, geographical place where they lived or their ancestors lived. They have a very strong connection and the natural surroundings that are very important for them. And then obviously the next one is that they have a specific political, social, cultural, economic systems, right? Even though the system may not be recognized now, but they do have these systems. They have their own way of selecting who will be the leader in the community, what kind of economic system they'll have, what kind of social interaction they'll have. Those are all based on particular group who lived there pre-colonial time or from the beginning of time. The other part of it is that the indigenous community has their own distinct language, culture, and belief, right? So they have their own language. They may use a different alphabet now, but their language is different. Their culture is different. They have a unique belief system. Most of the indigenous communities, they make up non-dominant group, right? So they are always outside of the dominant group. They are always marginalized group in some form or shape. Also is that they indigenous communities always, one of the things they do is they are always interested and committed to maintain their ancestral land, ancestral environment, ancestral systems, systems of culture, systems of language, systems of leadership, systems of ways of doing things. All of those things are already there, and they are always committed to making sure that it keeps on going. So now I have a couple of readings for you and sites. You can go and look at them and learn more about it, which later on we can discuss on it. Hopefully it helps you broaden your idea about what is Indigenous and what counts, and then how people have done research on this. And this ends the part one of this. Welcome, SK Able Fellows. This is part two of my presentation. In this part, I'll be talking about several theories that have been utilized in Indigenous science knowledge or research in Indigenous communities or people, schools, teachers, curriculum, many of these things. You very likely might have encountered them in many of your readings, as well as in readings that were related to Indigenous science knowledge or Indigenous communities. So in this respect, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about a couple of them in general and hopefully through readings and just perusing a couple of sites that I have provided at the end of this part will help you understand or get some idea about other theories that are there that scholars are using it. So let's go ahead. So in the first theory that I have listed over here is critical race theory. And so what it is that in terms of critical race theory is that this theory especially allows researchers, practitioners, and policymakers to be conscious about race. Because without being conscious about race, there is very little change that we can see in schools or in classroom or in curriculum that influences Indigenous communities or communities that have been historically oppressed. So in critical race theory, race is central to understanding and critiquing the existing both the structural discrimination as well as discrimination that we see in curriculum, in teaching, in engagement between teachers and students, engagement between curriculum and students. So one of the things that critical race theory allows us to explore is to understand both the overt and the covert ways race has been used in order to discriminate people who are not from dominant group. In the context of United States, our dominant group is white people. Therefore, critical race theory allows us to explore how race plays out in discriminating against Indigenous communities, immigrants, African American communities, Hispanic communities, Asian communities, many of these communities. The next one is critical pedagogy. So when we talk about critical pedagogy, what we are talking about is that it is an approach to teaching and learning that is predicated on the idea that we need to foster agency and we need to empower learners. Because the only way we can bring change is by empowering learners or providing them agency through learning. And so one of the most important aspects of critical pedagogy is to critique and provide new interpretation of existing curriculum, pedagogy, uh, classroom interactions. All of those things are really important. The other part of critical pedagogy is it's about reflective to issues of discrimination, both political, social, and cultural. So in critical pedagogy, consciousness is an important component of it, and especially social and political consciousness is an important component of critical pedagogy. And so what it is that critical pedagogy allows us to engage learners, engage curriculum in such a way that it provides agency and empowerment to the learners or people who are oppressed. Therefore, critical pedagogy is an important theoretical lens through which we can explore Indigenous science knowledge, Indigenous teaching and learning, as well as the curriculum. The next one is tribal critical race theory or critical indigenous theory. It is basically an extension of critical race theory and elements of critical pedagogy. What it is doing is it's asking the question, how is indigenous communities specifically have been oppressed in education, in economy, in their cultural discrimination. So one of the things about critical indigenous theory is that how treaties and the history has subjugated indigenous people as underclass. And that's what it's asking. So the other thing that's important is that whenever we talk about communities is that they are not monolithic, nor do they have just single identity. So what it is that there is an intersection between an individual, the community, the economic status, the social status, the educational status. Therefore, intersectionality allows us to understand indigenous communities and people not as monolithic group, but they are different groups. Right? So the tribes that are within a country differ from each other depending on which geographical locations they are in, because they are different tribes, they have different language, they have different culture. Therefore, saying that all indigenous communities across the world or within a geographic region are same is a wrong way to understand uh, uh, how indigenous communities experience discrimination. Therefore, intersectionality is an important component of it is for us. The other is racial justice or social justice. What it is that whenever we are talking about justice, we are always talking about redistribution of power that allows individuals and communities to gain access to resources and opportunities for social and political transformation. That is an important component of it is that social justice is firmly anchored in the idea of equity that advocates for cultural, social, political, gender, racial, and educational opportunities, as well as it allows for critical exploration of the lives of marginalized people. Both racial justice and social justice are about access to the world and transforming the world, meaning that we can transform or we can bring change by asking and pushing back against the structural discrimination that exists in the society, especially in education. Therefore, when we think about indigenous science knowledge, we are thinking about is, is its ability for providing opportunity and access to indigenous communities and students in the fields of science or STEM in general, if you like to say so. And therefore, social justice is about, or racial justice is about questioning, challenging, and reconstructing knowledge. And that's an important part of it, is that we want to reconstruct existing Western dominated science through indigenous knowledge and indigenous science. Uh, Obviously, to really famous and well utilized theories are culturally relevant pedagogy or culturally sustaining pedagogy. Both of them rely on the idea that culture has to be an integral part of learning and teaching. Therefore, we have to engage students, especially Indigenous students, based on their culture. One of the things both culturally relevant pedagogy and culturally sustaining pedagogy, what they are saying is pedagogy is not neutral. Pedagogy is never neutral. It always has political, social, cultural biases embedded in them. Therefore, if we really want to lift up and help Indigenous students and teachers to be able to engage students in science or in STEM fields, we have to connect their lives and their culture and their practices to the practices of science. Therefore, meaning making is an important component of culturally relevant pedagogy and culturally sustaining pedagogy is. Therefore, one of the things to think about is that both of them advocate for socio-political consciousness, meaning that students should be able to use science knowledge and indigenous knowledge to question, research, ask difficult structural deficits that have always pushed indigenous communities and oppressed communities to the margins or to the bottom of educational, economic, political hierarchies. Therefore, culturally relevant pedagogy and culturally sustaining pedagogy are really important ways to understand teaching and learning of indigenous communities. And I would like to encourage you to think about culturally relevant pedagogy and culturally sustaining pedagogy more through the lens of social and political consciousness. Therefore, you can ask students to be activists. You can ask students to look for social change or work for social change. You can ask students to be more transformative in their thinking and learning. Therefore, we want to think about these theories not merely as a way to understand, but also to be able to help students think about their social, political, cultural issues more critically so that they can push back the discriminatory practices, cultures that are there that are not allowing them to engage in science or allowing them not to bring their knowledge from their communities in science to be more productive, to be more engaging. Therefore, if we are thinking about students to be activists, we do want to think about more from the lens of social and political consciousness. So here are a couple of readings that I encourage you to look at it. There's some of the websites too that will allow you to understand some of these theories and maybe give you more sort of enticement to look into them. And so this ends the part 2. In part 3, we will talk about what are different aspects of research. What should we think about research in indigenous communities or students and teachers with indigenous groups. Welcome to part 3 of research assumptions and methods in indigenous and traditional science research. In this section, I'll be talking about what are the assumptions of research in indigenous science or in indigenous communities? And 2 is what does research mean for the indigenous communities and also for researchers who do work with indigenous communities? So I have a quote over here from uh, Toya Smith is that The research related to indigenous communities is about decolonizing the thinking, the processes, and the meaning of research, and also meaning of what does it mean to do research. Two, it's about human relationship and the place where indigenous communities live. So the difference between Western and indigenous research method is that the research done in collaboration with indigenous communities or people is it's not only about revealing the knowledge, but it's also about balancing the power between the researcher and the community. It's about decolonizing ways of thinking, ways of meaning sense, and ways of understanding. And the last part is about healing. It's about well-being of the community and the indigenous people. So let's talk about a couple of assumptions of research when we are doing research in indigenous communities. So what we want to think about as researchers are what are ontological assumptions, right? How do indigenous communities construct social reality? What does it mean to them, right? And so similarly, what are the epistemological assumptions? What does knowledge creation mean? One of the things you will hear on and on whenever you are doing research in indigenous communities is that knowledge is not just about revealing something, it's also about its usefulness and purpose to the community. And that's one of the things that you will have to keep on thinking as you are thinking about research in indigenous communities. The next is axiological assumptions, or what are the values, right? So when we as researchers come trained in or educated in Western ways of doing things, Western ways of valuing things, that means it starts to creep in our own research. Therefore, we have to think about what does research mean? What does the role a researcher brings in the community, and what does the community wants the researchers to take the role of or about. Therefore, whenever we are thinking about indigenous research, we need to think about not only what we want to learn, but also what's the value of that learning. And so we want to think about that part. And then the last part is the methodological assumptions. What it is that how do we collect data? How do we go about understanding what it means for indigenous communities to know about a phenomenon or know about a culture or know about their practices? And so we want to think about what are different ways we explore these things. And I will touch a couple of methodological assumptions in indigenous communities in the very next slide. So let's talk about first axiological because that's about value, right? So whenever we are thinking about axiological assumptions doing research in indigenous communities, the very first thing that's really important is responsibility. What is a responsibility of a researcher for the indigenous communities? As I said earlier in previous presentation in part one and part two, is that it has to benefit for the well-being of the community. That is what indigenous research is about. It's not about showing what are challenges or what indigenous communities don't know or what can we get from indigenous communities. It's about responsibility, which means it's for them, not for the researcher. The next part is that indigenous communities are based on the value of respect for the environment, respect for the place, respect for the resources, and respect for the spirit of ancestors. Therefore, whenever we are thinking about research in indigenous communities, we are always thinking about honoring the knowledge, honoring and sharing with people in the community so that it benefits them. The third part of is that reciprocity. What that basically means is that research is a shared project. Therefore, whenever we do research in indigenous communities, we have to understand that the community is part of us meaning the researchers, whether they are from outside or within the community. So we want to think about research as a shared process, not as just the responsibility of the researcher or the researcher's team. And then the last part, generally outsiders forget, especially people who come from universities, from Western educated philosophy or idea or framework of research, is that indigenous communities are sovereign nations. They are sovereign people. Therefore, we have to respect who they are, what are their laws, what they want us to know, and what they don't want us to know. We have to be respectful of that. Therefore, we need to understand the rights and responsibilities of ourselves, but also where do indigenous community reside in terms of the rules and regulations that they have. Therefore, it is perfectly fine, and we as researchers should be perfectly fine if a indigenous community says we cannot carry out a certain research, or we cannot collect certain data, or we cannot share certain information that we gathered. It's perfectly fine because it is their knowledge, it is their place. So we have to respect that. So what is the goal, or what are the goals of indigenous research, right? What are we looking for, or what are we trying to help understand for ourselves and for the community? So first of all is that indigenous research, the goal is to develop indigenous identity, who they are, what they stand for, what their knowledge is, and how they value that knowledge, and their culture and practices. The next part is mutual interdependence. That basically means as researchers, we have to share the power that we carry as researchers and the indigenous communities in which we go and do research. There has to be a mutual respect of that. If there is none, then we end up harming indigenous communities more so than helping them. The other part of indigenous research is about prolonged immersion. So one of the challenges of university researchers or researchers from outside, and the way it's framed, is that researcher is always outside the participants. That is not true. Indigenous communities, whenever we do studies or whenever we carry out research in that community, we have to understand that we are there for a long haul, because indigenous communities value relationship, not efficiency. If we look for efficiency, then our research will fail, not us only, but it also will fail indigenous communities. So we cannot allow that to happen. Therefore, doing research in indigenous community is about building a relationship. It's a relationship for a very long time to come. Therefore, as researchers, that has to be one of our goals too. The other part of it is that methodological flexibility. What does that mean? That basically means that there are different ways of collecting data, and different ways of collecting data depends on the indigenous community that we go to. Therefore, we have to be flexible in how we collect data. And what are the processes of collecting data or gathering information in an indigenous community? And I'll talk about that very shortly. So here are some of cultural specific research methods. So we have Kaupapa Maori. What that idea of research method is that it's greatly ingrained and steeped in the principles and cultures and philosophy of being a Maori, and that we have to respect. So as researchers, if we are going into Maori communities to do research, then we have to always think about that their culture, their principle, their philosophy of understanding and sharing information and gathering information, we have to respect that. And that is a part of the method of doing research. Talking circles, so many of us who work in North American indigenous communities, we know this. And it's basically is that you share your ideas, knowledge, principles based on the respect around a communal feeling, which is basically you sit in a circle and you share your things as your turn comes. The next one is Anisinabe Mino Bimadijuin. What that is about is that in that community, in Anishinaabe community, whenever we think about doing research, we are thinking about doing research that focuses on not only future, but also focuses on the present and the past. And the idea is that we are always looking for good of life. We are always looking for a respectful way of understanding life. Therefore, when we think about doing research in Anishinaabe communities in North America, we have to think about research is not about just the future, but it also is about the past and the present. Therefore, they will share ideas and their culture and their values that are spanning past, present, and future. And it is always for the good and respect of life. Pathway is another method of doing research, and that is generally an idea in Aboriginal communities in Australia. It basically means is that there is a particular structure of way of doing research. That basically means you follow a particular path of respect in order to carry out a research. And the other part of it is that how do you then go about doing it? Therefore, there is always this mutual understanding or thinking about this respect for listening. So this is one of the interesting things about all indigenous communities is that listening is an important part of doing research. Listening is an important part of being part of the community. Therefore, listening is also about respect. And we have to think about that as a researcher. Just asking series of questions does not allow us to understand, nor does it allow us to respect what people are sharing with us. The next one is Pakapa Kapa, which is basically Filipino indigenous communities. And in most of Filipino islands, this is the way people think about exploration, is that and a phenomenon, anything you want to research and any data you collect, you look at it without any theoretical frame. And so that is very different from Western way of thinking that you have to frame every research before you go in. So if you look at Filipino indigenous researchers, you will find this way of thinking about not having a framework to look at a phenomena, but as well as collecting the data. And then the last one, which you will in many Pacific islands, including Hawaii, is that Paparaluti is a way to connect different stories in a meaningful way that captures the knowledge that ancestors have given to people from one generation to another. And that's how they think about it. That means the stories are weaved in many different ways. There are many tangential uh, conversations about a phenomenon, which from a linear point of view of Western way of thinking about research does not fit in it. Therefore, when we think about research, we have to think about how in specific cultural ways indigenous communities share their knowledge and practices. So we have to be very mindful of that. So the question is that as researchers, what should we do? What are some of the things we can think about? So we all work at an institution, a university, whether it's public, private, whatever it is. And then there are indigenous communities who have their own process of giving permission for research. So there is this tension that arises between university human subjects approval board and indigenous human subjects approval board, but it can be navigated. The very first thing we have to realize is that indigenous tribes or communities are sovereign nations. Therefore, they do not have to give permission to outside researchers to do study. So we have to respect that. Two, is that we also have to understand that because they are sovereign nation, therefore they may demand or will require certain aspects of research to be modified or adjusted, and we have to do that. And that especially happens in consent and assent forms. Consent and assent forms in from indigenous IRB board supersedes the university IRB consent and assent form. And we have to keep that in mind. The next process is that in indigenous IRB process, very likely indigenous communities or the IRB review board may ask you to be present in person when your IRB is reviewed. And you have to do that. And I went through that when I did my IRB for working with uh, Fond du Lac tribe. And just be aware of that. It's not about they don't want to give, they want to know who you are. Remember, for indigenous communities, relationships and respect matters a lot. Therefore, no matter how much money comes into the community, no matter how knowledgeable the outside researcher might be, it has less value than how much respect you give to the community and how much you care about them. And that is why they want you to see in person. The next is that indigenous IRBs are not there for obstacles. They are not there to create barriers. They are for protecting indigenous knowledge. Because we know in history that indigenous knowledge and communities have been decimated and taken advantage of by outside people, especially white uh, uh, settlers. And therefore, the IRB that exists in indigenous communities is not a barrier, it's a way for them to protect their knowledge, their practices, and their values. And then the last part is that, which is sometimes researchers who are outsiders do not like it, is that they need to have seek permission from indigenous communities, especially if they have the IRB board, a permission to publish whatever they have found in the research. We know that in the past, in the history of indigenous communities and settler interactions, is that settlers have always taken away indigenous knowledge without their permission and appropriated it for their benefit, and indigenous communities are still struggling to gain that right. Therefore, indigenous communities now requiring researchers to get permission from them before they publish, so the outside researchers do not publish information, practices, cultures that should not be shared outside the community. They are not going to allow you to publish. Therefore, you need to work with them. It's not about they don't want to share the knowledge, it's about how we respect their knowledge, right? Just the way everybody wants their knowledge to be respected, therefore indigenous communities want their knowledge to be respected. And we have to keep these things in mind as indigenous researchers or researchers in any regard. And so at the end, what I want to show you is that we have an example of indigenous knowledge method, and then what are the different ecological systems or ecological spaces we want to explore. And if you look at it, there are a lot of um, intersections in methodologies between Western way of doing science and indigenous way of doing science or creating knowledge. But what kinds of methods are valued in Western science versus indigenous science is slightly varied, but they all value different kinds of methods. And we have to keep this in mind, is that there is no one method. The key thing whenever working with indigenous communities is relationship, respect are two very essential aspects of doing research in indigenous communities. And at the end of the day, it has to be for the well-being of the indigenous communities. Thank you very much. Here are some of the readings, and I hope you will be able to think about your own research, your own way of engaging in different research. But I think all of these values are really important for us as researchers, especially if we are working with indigenous communities or any community that is marginalized. And thank you very much. Hope you have a very engaging and fruitful ISK Able Institute. Thank you.